Blood froze before it hit the snow in the winter of 1886. Josephine Carter didn't know that yet, but as the wind howled through the splintered remains of her stagecoach, she knew she was going to die. She was 22, penniless, and abandoned in the merciless Montana high country. Then came the crunch of heavy boots. A man built like the mountains themselves stepped through the whiteout, a rifle slung over a shoulder draped in silver-tip grizzly fur. He didn't offer a gentle hand or a comforting lie. He offered a harsh, unvarnished truth. "You need shelter," he grunted, his eyes like chips of flint. "And my girls need a mother." Historical records from the Montana Historical Society often refer to the winter of 1886 as the Big Die-Up, a season so brutal it wiped out millions of cattle and froze men standing upright. According to the private, archived diaries of Josephine Carter, the cold was not just a weather event, it was a living, breathing predator. Josephine Josie, to the society friends she had left behind in Street Louis, was shivering in the wreckage of a Concord stagecoach. The axle had snapped in the treacherous pass near the Gallatin Range. The driver, a coward named Amos, had unhitched the only surviving draft horse and ridden for Bozeman, leaving Josie to the mercy of a storm that was dropping the temperature to 40 below zero. She had come west seeking a position as a governess, fleeing a ruined family reputation and crushing debt. Now, she was simply trying to keep her heart beating. The numbness had already claimed her toes and fingers. A strange, terrifying warmth was beginning to spread through her chest, the final, hallucinatory stage of hypothermia. She closed her eyes, ready to surrender to the white sleep. That was when the mountain man found her. Harrison Blake did not look like a savior. He looked like an extension of the savage landscape. Standing well over 6 feet, he was clad in heavy buckskin and furs, his face obscured by a thick, dark beard and snow-crusted eyebrows. When he peered into the carriage, he didn't express shock or pity. He reached in, his massive hands wrapping around her waist, and hauled her over his shoulder like a sack of grain. Josie faded in and out of consciousness during the agonizing trek. She remembered the blinding sting of snow, the rhythmic crunch of his snowshoes, and the smell of wood smoke, pine resin, and raw leather. When she finally opened her eyes, the biting cold had been replaced by a heavy, suffocating heat. She was lying on a pallet of wolf skins near a massive stone fireplace. The walls around her were thick, unhewn timber, caulked with mud and moss. Above her, hanging from the rafters, were drying herbs, traps, and strips of smoked venison. "Drink." The voice was a low, gravelly rumble. Harrison knelt beside her, holding a tin cup of boiling hot willow bark tea to her cracked lips. His eyes, she noticed for the first time, were a piercing, stormy grey. "Where?" Josie rasped, her throat feeling like it was lined with shattered glass. "My claim, 20 miles from where you wrecked," Harrison said, pulling the cup away when she coughed. "You're lucky the wolves didn't find you first. Your driver froze to death 2 miles down the ridge. Found his horse, though." Josie absorbed the horror of the news, the reality of her isolation sinking in. Before she could process the grief or the terror, a rustling sound drew her attention to the shadows near a heavy oak table. 2 small faces peered out from behind a stack of firewood. They were little girls, perhaps 8 and 5 years old. They wore oversized, patched flannel shirts that dragged on the floor, their hair tangled into wild, uncombed mats. They stared at Josie with the wide, skittish eyes of feral animals. "Sadie, May," Harrison said, his voice softening only a fraction. "Come out of the dark." The older girl, Sadie, stepped forward hesitantly. She had her father's grey eyes, sharp and guarded. The younger one, May, clutched her sister's hand, a dirty thumb planted firmly in her mouth. They didn't look like children. They looked like survivors. "They ain't used to strangers," Harrison muttered, standing up and towering over the room. He walked to the cast-iron stove and began stirring a pot of stew. "Ain't used to women, neither, not for a long time." Josie pulled the wolfskin tighter around her trembling shoulders. She was entirely at the mercy of a man who looked capable of killing a bear with his bare hands, in a cabin buried under 10 feet of snow, miles from civilization. It took 2 weeks for Josie to regain her strength. The frostbite had blistered her feet and hands, leaving her largely immobile. During that time, she watched the silent, clockwork routine of the Blake household. Harrison was a man of action, not words. He left before dawn to run his trap lines, returning after dark smelling of blood, cold, and wet fur. The girls were left alone for hours. They didn't play like normal children. They sat quietly, whittling sticks with terrifyingly sharp knives or staring out the frosted window. When Josie tried to speak to them, to tell them stories of Street, Louis, or ask about their lives, they responded with silence or monosyllabic grunts. The cabin was a fortress, but it was a miserable one. It lacked any feminine touch, any warmth beyond the literal heat of the fire. The girls were surviving, but they were deeply neglected. On the 15th night, the storm finally broke, revealing a sky scattered with hard, diamond-like stars. Josie was sitting by the fire, mending a tear in her wool skirt, when Harrison sat heavily in the chair opposite her. He placed a leather pouch on the table, It clinked with the sound of silver coins. "The pass will be clear enough for a horse in 3 days," Harrison said, staring at the flames. "I can take you to Bozeman. Leave you at the boarding house." Josie's hands stilled. Bozeman. Civilization. But then the reality hit her. "I have no money, Mr. Blake. My luggage, my savings, they were lost in the coach." Harrison nodded slowly, as if expecting this. "You're an educated woman. I saw the books in your satchel before the snow ruined them. I was meant to be a governess for the mayor's family. But I am weeks late. The position is surely filled." Harrison leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on his knees. The firelight cast deep, menacing shadows across his face. "I'm a trapper. I hunt elk for the mining camps. It takes me away from this cabin for days at a time. The mountains ain't no place for little girls to be left alone." He paused, the silence stretching out, heavy and thick. "I owe a man in town, Hiram Lockwood. He owns the valley, the bank, and half the law. I'm paying him off, pelt by pelt, but it takes time. Time I spend away from Sadie and May. They're turning wild, Miss Carter. I know it. I ain't blind." He looked directly at her, his grey eyes piercing her defenses. "You need shelter, protection from the winter, and from men who look at a pretty, destitute woman in a mining town as easy prey. And my girls need a mother, someone to teach them letters, how to wash properly, how to be human." Josie's breath hitched. "Are you proposing employment, Mr. Blake?" "I'm proposing a contract," Harrison said bluntly. "Marriage. Before a judge in town. It makes it ironclad. Lockwood can't run you off my claim if you're my legal wife. In exchange, I give you half of everything I make from the furs, a roof, and my protection. I don't expect affection. I don't expect a wife in my bed. I just need a mother for my daughters." Josie stared at him. It was a cold, calculated transaction. A marriage of convenience born out of pure, desperate survival. She looked at the loft where Sadie and May were sleeping, huddled together for warmth. She thought of the freezing streets of Bozeman, the predatory men in the saloons, and her absolute lack of prospects. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "Because you didn't cry when you woke up with frostbite," Harrison replied. "You grit your teeth. You've got iron in you. These mountains break fragile things. You ain't fragile." The next week, a terrified, traveling circuit judge named Miller was brought to the cabin. Standing in the dirt floor kitchen, wearing her only clean dress, Josephine Carter became Josephine Blake. There was no kiss, only the scratching of a pen on a marriage certificate. As Harrison shook the judge's hand, Josie looked at the piece of paper. Her life had changed forever. She was no longer a disgraced socialite. She was a mountain man's wife, a mother to 2 wild girls, and bound to a man she knew absolutely nothing about. Spring came to the Gallatin Valley not with a gentle bloom, but with a violent thaw. The snowmelt turned the mountain trails into treacherous rivers of mud, and the air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles. Inside the cabin, the ice was thawing too. Josie had thrown herself into her end of the bargain. She scrubbed the floors with lye soap, sewed new, properly fitting clothes for Sadie and May from bolts of cotton Harrison brought from town, and instituted daily lessons by the fire. The girls were brilliant but deeply scarred. Sadie, the oldest, learned to read with a ravenous hunger, devouring the few books Josie had managed to salvage. May stopped sucking her thumb and began to laugh, a bright, startling sound that seemed to shock even Harrison when he heard it. Yet, a shadow lingered over the cabin. Josie felt it in the way Harrison avoided speaking of the past. She felt it in the locked cedar chest pushed into the darkest corner of the loft. One afternoon, while Harrison was out tracking a mountain lion that had been harassing his mules, Josie decided to clean the loft thoroughly. As she moved the cedar chest to sweep behind it, the rusted padlock suddenly snapped open the internal spring broken from years of freezing temperatures. Curiosity, a dangerous trait in the West, overtook her. She lifted the heavy wooden lid. Inside, the smell of dried lavender and stale copper wafted up. It wasn't filled with blankets or keepsakes. It held a single beautiful velvet dress, the color of midnight blue, and right over the heart, the fabric was stiff, dark, and rusted with dried blood. Beneath the dress lay a silver locket on a broken chain. Josie's heart hammered against her ribs. She slammed the chest shut just as she heard the cabin door open downstairs. "Josie?" Harrison called out. She hurried down the ladder, her hands shaking, trying to mask her panic. "I'm here." A few days later, the mud had dried enough for the wagon to make the journey into Bozeman. It was Josie's first trip to town since the blizzard. The town was a chaotic sprawl of false front buildings, muddy streets, and loud saloons. Miners, cowboys, and merchants filled the boardwalks. But as Harrison drove the wagon down Main Street, a palpable hush fell over the crowds. People stopped and stared. Women pulled their children closer. Men touched the brims of their hats, not in respect, but in wary acknowledgement. Harrison ignored them, his jaw clenched tight. He parked the wagon in front of Gable's Mercantile. "I need to go to the assayer's office, take the girls, buy whatever provisions we need." He handed Josie a roll of bills. As Josie walked into the Mercantile with Sadie and May, the chatter inside died instantly. The proprietor, a stern woman named Mrs. Gable, watched them with hawkish eyes. "Well, Mrs. Gable finally said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I heard the rumors, but I didn't believe 'em. Harrison Blake took another wife." Josie kept her chin high. "I am Mrs. Blake. I have a list of provisions." Mrs. Gable took the list, her eyes darting to the girls, then back to Josie. She leaned over the counter, lowering her voice. "You're a long way from home, dear. Do you even know what you married?" "I married a trapper," Josie said firmly. "You married a ghost maker," a smooth, cultured voice said from the doorway. Josie turned. A man stood there, dressed in a sharply tailored broadcloth suit that looked wildly out of place in the frontier mud. He had a silver-tipped cane and a smile that didn't reach his cold, reptilian eyes. Mrs. Gable immediately shrank back. "Mr. Lockwood." Hiram Lockwood stepped into the store, looking Josie up and down like a piece of livestock. "I must say, Blake has excellent taste. Much more refined than poor Sarah." At the mention of the name, Sadie grabbed Josie's skirt, hiding behind her legs. "Who are you?" Josie demanded, though she already knew. "I'm the man who owns the dirt your husband's cabin sits on," Lockwood purred, stepping closer. "Tell me, Mrs. Blake, did he spin you a tragic tale? Did he tell you his first wife died of the winter fever?" Josie remembered the bloody dress in the cedar chest. Her mouth went dry. Lockwood smiled, a terrifying show of white teeth. "Sarah didn't die of a fever. She died of a bullet to the chest. She was trying to leave him, running to me for protection." Blake caught her on the ridge. Lockwood leaned in, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper. "He has a habit of burying his mistakes, Mrs. Blake. Be careful you don't end up under the snowflakes yourself." Lockwood tipped his hat and walked out, leaving Josie frozen in the middle of the store. The walls of her sanctuary had just shattered. The ride back to the claim was agonizingly silent. The sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, casting long, dark shadows across the valley. As soon as the girls were asleep in the loft, Josie turned to Harrison, who was oiling his Winchester rifle by the fire. "I met Hiram Lockwood today," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. Harrison's hands stopped moving. He didn't look up. The silence stretched so long the crackling of the fire sounded like gunshots. "I know about Sarah." Josie pushed, stepping closer to him. "I know about the dress in the chest. Lockwood said you killed her when she tried to run away." Harrison slowly set the rifle down. He finally looked at her, and the raw, violent agony in his grey eyes made Josie take a step back. He didn't yell. He didn't defend himself. "Lockwood is a liar," Harrison said, his voice a lethal, vibrating rumble. "I didn't kill my wife." He stood up, towering over her, the firelight painting him in demonic hues. "Lockwood killed her because she refused to sell him our land. And if he finds out you've been digging into the past, he'll put a bullet in you, too." The morning after the confrontation in the cabin, the air was thick enough to choke on. Harrison Blake did not speak of Hiram Lockwood, nor did he offer any further defense of his innocence. Instead, he woke before dawn, his massive silhouette moving mechanically through the dim light as he packed his canvas panniers and saddled his 2 mules. He was heading for the high timber near the Madison River, a treacherous 3-day ride, to check a series of beaver traps he had set before the Great Freeze. It was the longest he would be away since Josie had arrived. Before he walked out the heavy oak door, Harrison turned back. He walked to the mantel, retrieved a heavy, oil-wrapped bundle, and laid it on the dining table. He folded back the canvas to reveal a Colt single-action Army revolver, its blued steel worn grey at the muzzle, alongside a box of heavy lead cartridges. "The cylinder is full, resting on an empty chamber," Harrison instructed, his voice devoid of emotion, though his eyes lingered on her face. "You pull the hammer back until it clicks twice. You don't point it unless you intend to kill what's on the other side of the barrel. You keep the door barred. You don't open it for anyone, not a lost traveler, not a wounded miner, nobody." Josie looked at the gun, then up at her husband. The space between them felt like a chasm, filled with the ghost of a woman in a blood-stained velvet dress. "I understand," she said quietly. Harrison stared at her for a long moment, a muscle feathering in his jaw. For a second, Josie thought he might reach out, might try to bridge the terrible distance Lockwood's poison had created. Instead, he simply pulled his Stetson low over his brow, turned, and walked out into the freezing spring drizzle. With Harrison gone, the cabin felt impossibly large and suffocatingly quiet. The spring thaw was in full, violent effect. The mountain runoff had turned the yard into a quagmire of thick, sucking mud that made stepping outside a grueling chore. For the first 2 days, Josie kept the girls indoors, focusing heavily on their arithmetic and reading, trying to drown out the relentless drumming of the rain on the cedar shake roof. But confinement bred restlessness. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the rain finally broke, giving way to a pale, watery sun. Josie wrapped herself in a heavy wool shawl and stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the sharp scent of wet pine and decaying leaves. She walked the perimeter of the clearing, her boots sinking deep into the muck. Behind the cabin, past the woodshed and a dense thicket of wild blackberry bushes, she noticed a small wrought-iron fence partially swallowed by the overgrowth. her breath caught in her throat. She pushed through the thorny branches, her skirt catching and tearing, until she stood before a single, modest headstone carved from river rock. Sarah Eleanor Blake, beloved wife, devoted mother, may God grant her the peace the earth denied. Josie knelt in the damp earth, tracing the rough-hewn letters. Beloved wife. A man who murdered his wife in a fit of rage did not carve a stone with such painstaking care. He did not build a wrought iron fence to keep the coyotes away. He did not lock her dress away in a cedar chest like a sacred relic. A sudden, overwhelming conviction washed over Josie. Lockwood was lying, but if Lockwood had killed Sarah, why did Harrison believe his wife was running away from him? Determined to find the truth, Josie returned to the cabin. The girls were occupied by the hearth, drawing pictures on a slate board. Josie went to the loft. She didn't open the cedar chest that felt like a violation she wasn't ready to commit again. Instead, she began a meticulous search of the corners, the floorboards, the rafters. If Sarah was planning to leave, or if she was in trouble, a woman like that, a mother, would have left something behind. A note, a ledger. It took an hour, but she found it. Beneath the straw mattress of the bed Harrison refused to sleep in, a loose floorboard shifted under her weight. Josie pried it up with the edge of a fireplace poker. Hidden in the dusty cavity was a small, rusted tin box, originally meant for storing loose tea. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were 3 letters, still sealed, addressed to a Miss Clara Miller in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Below the letters was a small, leather-bound diary. Josie opened the diary to the final entry, dated exactly 2 weeks before the winter of 1885 set in. Hiram Lockwood cornered me outside the assayer's office today. The man is a devil. He knows the deed to the lower pasture is in my name, inherited from my father. He told me if I do not sign it over to him by month's end, he will have his men plant stolen rustled cattle on our ridge. He will hang Harrison legally. Harrison is too proud, too blind with his own honor to see the trap closing around us. He thinks his rifle is enough to protect us. It isn't. Lockwood has the law in his pocket. I cannot tell Harrison. He would ride into town and kill Lockwood, and swing from a rope for it. I have gathered the last of my mother's silver. Tomorrow, while Harrison is checking the northern traps, I will take the wagon. I will go to Virginia City. There is a federal judge there, a man outside of Lockwood's jurisdiction. I will pay him to file an injunction. I must do this quietly. I pray Harrison forgives my absence when I return. Josie dropped the diary, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Sarah hadn't been running away from Harrison. She had been running to save him. Lockwood had intercepted her on the road, murdered her, and let Harrison believe his wife had abandoned him and their children. It was a psychological torture as brutal as the physical act of murder. The sound of a horse whinnying sharply snapped Josie out of her shock. She scrambled down the ladder just as the hound under the porch began a frantic, vicious barking. Josie rushed to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtains. 3 men were riding into the muddy yard. They were not lost travelers. They wore long canvas dusters, their horses lathered with sweat despite the cold. The man in the lead, a heavily scarred brute with a bowler hat pulled low, spurred his horse directly up to the edge of the porch. Josie recognized the type instantly from the stories in Street Lewis. These were hired guns, enforcers. "Mrs. Blake," the man shouted, his voice cutting through the damp air. "We know the mountain man is out on the Madison. Open the door. Mr. Lockwood sent us to deliver some legal paperwork regarding this property." Josie's blood ran cold. She looked at Sadie and May, whose eyes were wide with terror. "Go to the root cellar," Josie ordered, her voice eerily calm. "Now, do not make a sound until I come for you." As the girls scrambled to lift the heavy trapdoor in the kitchen floor, Josie walked to the dining table. She picked up the heavy Colt. The cold steel felt grounding in her hand. She pulled the hammer back. Click. Click. "Mrs. Blake, I ain't an overly patient man." The brute kicked his heavy boot against the solid oak door, rattling the hinges. "We can do this polite, or we can do this the hard way." Josie stepped up to the door. She didn't open it. Instead, she pressed the muzzle of the .45 directly against the wood, roughly at the height of a man's chest. "I have read your legal paperwork," Josie shouted through the timber, her voice projecting with a shocking, commanding authority, "and I am currently holding my response. It is a lead projectile, measuring .45 caliber. The hammer is drawn. If you strike my door again, I will fire it through the wood and into your heart. Do we have an understanding?" Silence fell over the porch, save for the nervous shifting of the horses. "You're a long way from parlor games, little lady," the man snarled, though he took a distinct step back from the door. "Lockwood practically owns this ridge. Blake is a dead man walking. You'd do well to pack your bags and leave while you still have a scalp." "Get off my land," Josie commanded, the iron Harrison had seen in her finally forging into something lethal. A moment later, she heard the squelch of hooves turning in the mud. She watched through the crack in the curtain as the 3 riders retreated down the trail. Josie didn't lower the gun until they were completely out of sight. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to use both of them to carefully decock the hammer. She had bought them time, but the war had officially arrived at their doorstep. Harrison returned 2 days later, his mules laden with pelts, oblivious to the fact that his sanctuary had been breached. He rode into the yard just as the sun was dipping below the jagged peaks of the Galatins, casting the valley in bruised hues of purple and deep red. The moment he swung down from his saddle, he saw them. Deep, churning hoofprints in the mud, right up to the edge of the porch. 3 distinct sets of tracks, shod horses, heavy riders. Josie watched through the window as Harrison froze. The stoic, unmovable mountain man seemed to fracture in an instant. He dropped the lead ropes of his mules, tearing his Winchester rifle from its scabbard, and sprinted for the door. He burst into the cabin, breathless, his eyes wildly scanning the room. He found Josie standing by the stove, stirring a pot of beans, the Colt resting casually on the counter beside her. Sadie and May were at the table, quietly practicing their letters. Harrison stopped dead, his chest heaving. He looked at the girls, whole and unharmed, and then at Josie. The sheer, overwhelming relief that washed over his face stripped away years of hardened defenses. He lowered the rifle, his hands trembling slightly, a physical impossibility for a man who could hold a crosshair steady in a blizzard. "Riders," he rasped, struggling to find his voice. "Lockwood's men," Josie replied, wiping her hands on her apron. She walked toward him, her demeanor remarkably steady. "They demanded entry. I informed them of the loaded revolver in my hand. They decided to leave." Harrison stared at her, utterly bewildered. This was not the fragile, ruined girl he had pulled from a frozen stagecoach. This was a woman who had defended his home, his children, with a cold, terrifying efficiency. "They could have killed you," he whispered, the reality of it hitting him like a physical blow. "They are cowards who do Lockwood's bidding," Josie said, reaching out. For the first time since they had met, she placed a gentle hand on his arm. His muscles were tight as coiled spring steel beneath his damp wool coat. "Harrison, you need to sit down. There is something you must see." She led him to the heavy oak chair by the fire. From the pocket of her skirt, she produced the rusted tin tea box and the leather-bound diary. "I was looking for a leak in the loft," Josie lied smoothly, protecting the sanctity of his private grief. "I found a loose floorboard. I found this." She handed him the diary, already open to the final page. Harrison took the book. His massive, calloused fingers, stained with grease and gunpowder, looked absurdly large against the delicate, feminine handwriting. Josie watched him read. She watched as the words systematically dismantled the lie he had been torturing himself with for over a year. As he reached the end of the passage, a ragged, awful sound tore from Harrison's throat. It was the sound of a man who had been holding his breath for a year, finally exhaled. Now, the truth that she had died out of love, trying to protect him, shattered him completely. He dropped his head into his hands, the diary slipping to the floor. His broad shoulders hitched as violent sobs racked his body. Josie didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his head, pressing his face into her stomach, holding him tightly. Harrison's arms came around her waist, clutching her with a desperate, crushing strength. He wept for the wife he had lost, for the agonizing guilt he had carried, and for the realization that his enemy had stolen everything from him through a lie. He killed her. Harrison whispered into Josie's dress, his voice raw and broken. "Lockwood killed her, and I let him walk the streets of Bozeman like a king. We will stop him," Josie said fiercely, her fingers stroking his thick, dark hair. "We will not let him take this land. We will not let him take the girls." That night, an unspoken boundary between them dissolved. When the girls were asleep, Harrison did not sit by the fire cleaning his rifle in silence. He sat beside Josie at the table. They spoke. He told her about building the cabin with his bare hands, about the early years before the mining conglomerates moved in, about the dreams he and Sarah had shared. Josie told him of her father's financial ruin in Street Lewis, the scandal that had forced her west, the desperation that had led her to that doomed stagecoach. Their marriage, born of ice and necessity, had suddenly found its pulse. But Hiram Lockwood was not a man who allowed his prey to breathe. 2 weeks later, the muddy trails had hardened into packed dirt roads. The mountain air was warming, bursting with the vivid greens of late spring. Josie was in the yard, hanging laundry on the line, when the sound of approaching wagons shattered the peace. Harrison, who was chopping firewood near the porch, immediately buried his axe into the chopping block. He turned, stepping in front of Josie, his hand dropping to the heavy knife on his belt. 2 large buckboards rattled into the clearing, accompanied by 4 men on horseback. Leading the procession was Hiram Lockwood, dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit, twirling his silver-tipped cane. Beside him in the wagon sat a man with a tin star pinned to his vest, Sheriff Bowman of the county seat. The riders fanned out, their hands resting on the pommels of their saddles, near their holstered weapons. "Blake!" Lockwood called out cheerfully, stepping down from the wagon into the dirt. "A beautiful morning for a relocation, wouldn't you say?" Harrison didn't move. "You're trespassing, Hiram. The sheriff knows the boundaries of my homestead claim." Sheriff Bowman, a man who looked distinctly uncomfortable and entirely bored, pulled a folded, heavy parchment document from his coat. He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, Harrison," Bowman said, not meeting his eyes. "Mr. Lockwood here has filed a federal claim under the General Mining Act of 1872. Surveyors from Helena mapped a quartz vein that runs directly beneath this ridge. Under federal law, mineral rights supersede surface homestead claims. This land now legally belongs to the Lockwood Mining Consortium. Harrison's jaw tightened. It was the oldest, dirtiest trick in the West. Wealthy barons used fraudulent geological surveys to steal prime timber and water rights from independent ranchers and trappers, hiding behind the impenetrable shield of federal mining law. There ain't a flake of quartz within 10 miles of this ridge, Bowman, and you know it, Harrison growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The Federal Assay Office says otherwise, Lockwood smiled, tapping his cane against his boot. The document is signed and sealed by a federal judge. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises, Blake. Take your mules, take your charming new bride, and get off my property. If you are still here, come Friday morning, the sheriff will remove you by force, and any resistance will be met with lethal, legal authority. Lockwood tipped his hat to Josie, his eyes glittering with malice. A shame to lose such a lovely home, Mrs. Blake. But progress cannot be halted. The wagons turned around, the riders keeping their eyes fixed on Harrison until they disappeared down the tree line. Silence descended on the cabin once more. The legal noose had been pulled tight. They were utterly outmatched. Lockwood had the law, the men, and the money. Harrison turned to Josie. The fire in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, devastating resignation. Pack your things. Pack the girls' clothes. We'll head for the Wyoming Territory. I can hunt down there. We can start over. Josie looked at the cabin. She looked at the porch where she had stood her ground. She thought of the grave out back, of the woman who had died trying to save this sanctuary. She thought of Sadie and May, who had finally stopped looking like feral animals and started looking like daughters. She turned back to the mountain man she had married. She didn't see a defeated man. She saw a man who needed someone to remind him how to fight. No, Josie said, her voice ringing clear and absolute in the mountain air. Harrison blinked, startled. Josie, you don't understand. He has the federal government backing him. We can't fight an army of Pinkertons and the county sheriff. I said no. Harrison, Josie repeated, stepping up to him, looking fiercely into his stormy grey eyes. I ran from Street Lewis because I was afraid. I nearly froze to death on a mountain because I was helpless. I am not running anymore. This is my home. These are my daughters. She reached out, taking his massive, calloused hands in her own. We are not leaving this ridge, she vowed. Lockwood wants a war for this land. Then we give him one he will never forget. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, wavering shadows across the heavy timber walls. Maps of the Gallatin Valley, pulled from Harrison's old surveying tubes, were spread across the oak dining table. We cannot outgun him, Harrison, Josie said, her finger tracing the contour lines of their ridge. Lockwood employs 24 men, and he has the county sheriff in his pocket. If you shoot his men when they come to evict us, you become a murderer in the eyes of the law. He will hang you legally, just as Sarah feared. Harrison leaned his heavy palms on the table, his broad shoulders tense. A man defends his home, Josie. That's the only law that matters up here. That is the law of the mountains, Josie countered, her voice soft but unyielding. Lockwood is using the law of the territory, the General Mining Act. But he made a mistake, a fatal one. She reached into her apron pocket and produced Sarah's leather-bound diary, placing it squarely on the map. Sarah was going to Virginia City, Josie reminded him. To a federal judge, Lockwood killed her to stop this diary, and the original deed it mentions, from seeing the inside of a courtroom. It proves he knew the land belonged to her, and it provides a direct, undeniable motive for her murder. Furthermore, if we demand a neutral federal geologist to assay this ridge, they will find no quartz. Lockwood's survey is a forgery. If we prove the survey is forged, his mining claim collapses. Harrison stared at the little book as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. The territorial capital is in Helena now, but the federal district court still holds sessions in Virginia City. It's a 4-day ride. Lockwood has men watching the main trails, the train depot in Bozeman, and the telegraph office. The moment I ride down this mountain, they'll ambush me just like they did. He couldn't finish the sentence. The wound was too raw, too new. They will be watching for a man who stands 6'4" and wears grizzly fur, Josie said quietly. They will not be watching for me. Harrison's head snapped up, his grey eyes flashing with immediate, terrifying anger. No, absolutely not. I am not putting another wife on that road. Harrison, look at me, Josie demanded, stepping around the table and taking his face in both of her hands. She forced him to meet her gaze. Lockwood thinks I am a terrified, destitute girl you bought from a stagecoach wreck. He thinks I am a coward. I can ride your roan gelding down the back trails. I can reach the freight road by nightfall and pay passage on a commercial wagon heading west. I will be just another pioneer woman blending into the canvas. If he finds out, he won't, Josie interrupted, her thumbs tracing the rough lines of his cheekbones. Because you are going to stay here and make sure he thinks we are both cowering in this cabin. You will light the fires, you will chop the wood where his spies can see you, and you will protect Sadie and May. Harrison stepped back, pacing the length of the room like a caged panther. The agonizing conflict was evident in every line of his body. He was a man accustomed to solving his problems with a rifle and raw strength. Trusting the safety of his family to a piece of paper, and a woman he had known for mere months, went against every instinct he possessed. Yet, he looked at Josie. He saw the iron spine beneath her calico dress. She had stood down armed men on his porch. She had brought his daughters back to life. She had unearthed the truth that set his soul free. "There is a man in Virginia City," Harrison finally rumbled, his voice thick with reluctant surrender. "Chief Justice Decius Wade. He's a strict, hard-nosed man from Ohio, but he cannot be bought. Lockwood hates him. If you can get that diary to Wade's chambers, he'll issue an injunction and a warrant for Lockwood's arrest." Harrison walked to a heavy iron lockbox beneath his bed. He opened it and pulled out a small, blued steel Smith & Wesson .32 caliber revolver, alongside a heavy leather pouch that clinked with double eagle gold coins, his entire life savings. He walked back to Josie and pressed the gun and the gold into her hands. "Keep the gun hidden in your muff. Do not travel at night once you reach the valley floor," Harrison instructed, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper. He reached out, his massive hands trembling slightly as they wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. "Josie," he breathed, the smell of pine and wood smoke wrapping around her. "If you don't come back to me, if he takes you too." Josie didn't let him finish. She reached up, weaving her fingers into his dark hair, and pulled his mouth down to hers. It was not a kiss of convenience, nor a gentle peck of an arranged marriage. It was a fierce, desperate collision of two survivors. Harrison groaned, his arms wrapping around her with crushing, protective possession, lifting her slightly off the floor. The kiss tasted of salt, desperation, and a profound, unexpected love. When he finally set her down, Josie was breathless, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I survived a blizzard in the Gallatin's, Harrison Blake," she whispered fiercely, pressing her forehead against his chest. "A man in a cheap suit is not going to put me in the ground. I will be back. Hold the ridge." 2 hours before dawn, under the cover of a thick, rolling mountain fog, Josie saddled the roan gelding. She kissed the sleeping foreheads of Sadie and May, tucked the diary and the revolver into her bodice, and rode out into the freezing darkness. The war for the mountain had begun. The journey to Virginia City was a grueling descent into a lawless frontier. Josie abandoned the gelding at a sympathetic rancher's spread near the Madison River, trading a gold coin for a seat in the back of a freight wagon hauling timber to the territorial courts. For 3 days, she hid beneath heavy canvas tarps, her bones aching from the constant, bone-jarring rattle of the wheels, listening to the crude chatter of the teamsters and praying Lockwood's men hadn't caught her scent. When she finally stepped onto the wooden boardwalks of Virginia City, she was covered in soot and mud, her dress torn, her face hollowed by exhaustion. The town was a chaotic boomtown, teeming with miners, outlaws, and politicians. Josie didn't stop to eat or rest. She asked a passing deputy for directions and marched straight to the territorial courthouse, a grand, imposing brick building that felt entirely alien after months in a timber cabin. She bypassed the clerks and marched directly toward the heavy oak doors of the Chief Justice's chambers. A startled bailiff tried to stop her, but Josie shoved past him, throwing the doors open. Chief Justice Decius Wade, a stern man with severe mutton chops and spectacles, looked up from his mahogany desk, his expression a mix of outrage and shock. "Madam, you cannot barge in here. My name is Josephine Blake," Josie announced, her voice ringing off the high ceilings as she marched to his desk. She slammed the rusted tin box down on the polished wood. "My husband is Harrison Blake. 3 days ago, Hiram Lockwood filed a fraudulent federal mining claim to steal our homestead, aided by a corrupt county sheriff." Judge Wade's eyes narrowed at the mention of Lockwood. "Those are heavy accusations, Mrs. Blake. The General Mining Act is explicit. The survey is a forgery," Josie interrupted, pulling the leather-bound diary and the blood-stained letters from her bodice. "And this is the proof of why he forged it. This is the diary of Sarah Blake, Harrison's first wife. In it, she details Lockwood's extortion attempts over the land deed. She was riding to this very courthouse a year ago to seek your protection when she was murdered on the road. Lockwood let my husband believe she had abandoned him. I am here to finish her journey, Your Honor." Wade stared at the young, dirt-streaked woman. Slowly, he picked up the diary. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence as the Chief Justice of the territory read the final words of a murdered mother. 200 miles away, the 48-hour eviction notice had expired. Harrison stood on the front porch of his cabin, the heavy Winchester resting in the crook of his arm. The spring morning was unnervingly quiet. The birds had stopped singing. The hound under the porch was whining, its hackles raised. He had sent Sadie and May up to the loft, barricading the heavy trapdoor with an iron stoveplate. Lockwood didn't bother sending the sheriff this time. There was no pretense of law. Through the dense line of lodgepole pines, Harrison saw them. 10 men on horseback, armed with repeating rifles and carrying torches that smoked heavily in the damp air. They were Pinkerton rejects, Hired guns paid to clear land by any means necessary. At the head of the pack rode the scarred brute who had threatened Josie days earlier. "Blake!" the brute shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Time's up. You come out with your hands raised, and we let the little girls walk away. You stay inside, and we burn you all down to ash." Harrison didn't shout back. He simply racked the lever of the Winchester, the mechanical clack-clack sounding obscenely loud in the stillness. He had not spent the last 3 days idle. He was a master trapper, a man who understood the terrain better than he understood his own heartbeat. The yard was no longer a simple clearing. It was a deadly, engineered funnel. As the first 3 riders spurred their horses forward, arrogant and eager for blood, they crossed the invisible line Harrison had drawn between 2 massive oak trees. Their horses hit the tripwire. It wasn't a snare. It was a deadfall trigger. High in the canopy, a heavy rawhide rope snapped, releasing a massive, spiked log Harrison had hoisted days prior. It swung down like a pendulum, smashing into the lead riders with a sickening crunch of wood, bone, and screaming horses. Chaos erupted. The brute shouted orders, but his horse was rearing in panic. Harrison stepped off the porch and raised his rifle. He didn't fire wildly. He breathed in the smell of pine and gun oil, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The man holding a lit torch pitched backward out of his saddle, the torch falling into the dry brush at the edge of the yard, igniting a sudden wall of flame that spooked the remaining horses. "Spread out! Get to the tree line!" the brute screamed, drawing his revolvers and firing blindly toward the cabin. Bullets thudded into the thick timber walls, showering the porch in splinters. Harrison ducked behind the heavy stone well, jacking another round into the chamber. He was outnumbered, but he had the high ground and the cover. He fired again, shattering the knee of a man trying to flank him through the blackberry bushes. But there were too many of them. 2 men dismounted and crawled through the deep mud, using the burning brush for cover. They were creeping toward the blind side of the cabin, carrying a burlap sack soaked in kerosene. They intended to throw it onto the cedar shake roof. Harrison saw them too late. He swung his rifle, but a bullet grazed his shoulder, spinning him hard against the stone well. He gritted his teeth, tasting blood, as the men lit the kerosene sack. Suddenly, a massive, deafening roar echoed from the ridge above. It wasn't a rifle. It sounded like the wrath of God. A volley of heavy, coordinated gunfire tore through the trees, striking the dirt around the hired guns in geysers of mud and stone. The man holding the kerosene sack dropped it in terror as a bullet took off his hat. Through the thick smoke of the brush fire, a contingent of riders broke the tree line. They didn't wear canvas dusters. They wore dark, heavy coats, and bright, silver stars gleamed on their chests. United States Federal Marshals, and riding at the very front, atop a massive black draft horse beside the lead marshal, was Josephine. Her hair was wild, her dress was ruined, but she sat in the saddle like a queen returning to her kingdom. "Drop your weapons," by order of the Federal District Court of the Montana Territory. Marshal Boone roared, a heavy shotgun leveled at the hired guns. "Drop 'em or be cut to pieces." The remaining mercenaries, realizing they were outflanked and outgunned by federal law enforcement, threw their rifles into the mud and raised their hands. Josie slid off the horse before it even came to a full stop. She ran through the mud, ignoring the smoldering brush, her eyes frantically searching the yard. She found Harrison leaning against the stone well, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face pale but his grey eyes burning with an intense, overwhelming light. Josie threw herself into his arms, burying her face in his neck, indifferent to the blood and the gunpowder. Harrison dropped his rifle, his massive, uninjured arm wrapping around her, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "You held the ridge," Josie sobbed, tears of pure relief cutting tracks through the soot on her face. Harrison rested his cheek against the top of her head, closing his eyes as the sound of the marshals clapping irons on the hired men filled the yard. "Only because I knew you were coming back," the mountain man whispered. The acrid stench of burning lodgepole pine and spent black powder hung thick in the mountain air, an ugly contrast to the crisp spring morning. Marshal Boone, a man whose face looked as though it had been carved from saddle leather, barked orders as his deputies stripped the mercenaries of their gun belts and bound their wrists with heavy iron cuffs. Harrison remained slumped against the stone well, his breathing ragged. The adrenaline that had kept him upright was rapidly bleeding away, replaced by the searing, throbbing agony in his left shoulder. Josie dropped to her knees in the mud beside him. Her hands, usually so steady, shook as she tore away the heavy wool of his coat and the flannel beneath it. The bullet had taken a brutal, jagged gouge out of his deltoid muscle, a mess of torn flesh and welling dark blood, but miraculously, it had missed the bone and the vital arteries. "You're going to live," Josie breathed, pressing her ruined skirt against the wound to staunch the bleeding. She looked up at him, her eyes fierce. "But you are going to have a terrible scar to remind you not to fight an army by yourself." Harrison managed a weak, exhausted half-smile. He reached up with his good arm, his blood-stained fingers gently wiping a streak of soot from her cheek. "I wasn't fighting them by myself," he whispered. "I was just holding the door until my wife got home." Marshal Boone crunched through the gravel and stood over them, his heavy shotgun resting on his shoulder. He looked at the deadfall trap in the trees, the smoldering brush, and the groaning mercenaries. I've seen Pinkerton detachments do less damage with a Gatling gun, Blake. Boone noted, a grim knot of respect in his jaw. You run a hard claim. They brought the war to my front porch. Marshal, Harrison grunted, wincing as Josie applied more pressure to his shoulder. And we are going to finish it, Boone replied, pulling a heavy, wax-sealed document from his duster. Chief Justice Decius Wade issued a federal warrant for Hiram Lockwood. Charges are forgery of a federal claim, conspiracy to commit murder, and the outright assassination of Sarah Blake. Territorial Governor Samuel Hauser usually turns a blind eye to the mining barons, but Wade bypasses the governor. Lockwood's money can't buy him out of a federal noose. Josie looked toward the cabin. The girls. Harrison nodded, trying to push himself up. I need to see my daughters. Josie helped him to his feet, wrapping her arm tightly around his waist to bear his weight. Together, they limped up the splintered steps of the porch. The heavy oak door was riddled with bullet holes, but the iron hinges had held. Sadie! May! Josie called out, pushing the door open. The cabin smelled of fear and wood smoke. For a terrifying second, there was absolute silence. Then, the heavy scrape of the iron stoveplate being pushed aside echoed from the loft. Two small, terrified faces peered over the edge of the ladder. When they saw Josie standing there, covered in mud but very much alive, and their father leaning heavily against her, the dam broke. They scrambled down the ladder, abandoning all their feral caution, and slammed into their parents. May buried her face in Josie's apron, sobbing uncontrollably, while Sadie grabbed Harrison's good arm, her sharp grey eyes inspecting his bleeding shoulder with desperate anxiety. We're safe, Josie murmured, dropping to the floor to wrap her arms around both girls, pulling Harrison down into the embrace as well. It's over. The bad men are gone, and they are never coming back. Harrison pressed his face into his daughter's tangled hair, closing his eyes as a profound, settling peace washed over him. The ghost that had haunted this cabin, the lie that had fractured his family, was finally gone. 2 days later, the reality of the frontier's shifting power dynamics struck the town of Bozeman like a thunderclap. Hiram Lockwood was dining in the lavish parlor of the Bozeman Hotel, slicing into a rare elk steak, when the double doors were kicked open. Marshal Boone and 6 deputies flooded the room with shotguns leveled. Lockwood did not panic. He simply wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and reached for his checkbook, assuming this was a matter of a higher bribe. Marshal Boone, Lockwood purred. Whatever the misunderstanding, I assure you my bank can clear it up. Put the pen down, Hiram, Boone ordered, stepping forward and clamping a cold iron manacle around Lockwood's left wrist, securing it directly to the table leg. Your bank accounts have been frozen by federal decree. You are under arrest for the murder of Sarah Eleanor Blake. Lockwood's aristocratic mask finally slipped, his face draining of color. That is a territorial matter. You have no jurisdiction. Judge Wade disagrees, Boone interrupted coldly. A woman's diary is a powerful thing, Lockwood. Turns out she documented every threat you made before you put a bullet in her. You're going to the territorial penitentiary in Deer Lodge. And you will hang. As Lockwood was dragged out into the muddy street, kicking and screaming obscenities, Mrs. Gable and the other townsfolk watched in stunned silence. The absolute tyrant of the Gallatin Valley had been toppled, not by a rival mining conglomerate or a hired gun, but by a destitute girl who had refused to freeze to death in the snow. Summer arrived in the high country with a breathtaking, vibrant violence. The snowmelt fed the creeks until they roared, and the alpine meadows erupted in explosions of purple lupine and yellow arrowleaf balsam root. At the Blake homestead, the scars of the siege were slowly fading. Harrison, his shoulder mostly healed save for a deep, puckered ache when the rain came, had rebuilt the porch and reinforced the roof. The deadfall trap had been dismantled, replaced by a rope swing for the girls. The marriage of convenience had fundamentally transformed. There was no longer a cold, transactional distance between Harrison and Josie. They moved around each other in the small cabin with a magnetic, fluid awareness. He watched her when she read to the girls by the fire, his grey eyes heavy with a dark, consuming affection. She found herself lingering near the wash basin when he came in from the woods, entirely captivated by the raw, hoarded strength of his back as he washed the dirt from his skin. Yet, a fragile hesitation remained. They had fought a war together, but they had not yet navigated the profound intimacy of true husband and wife. One evening in late July, after Sadie and May had fallen asleep in the loft, Josie sat on the porch, a quilt wrapped around her shoulders, watching the fireflies dance at the edge of the timberline. The screen door creaked, and Harrison stepped out. He wasn't wearing his heavy buckskins. He wore a simple, unbuttoned flannel shirt and canvas trousers. He carried 2 tin cups of dark, hot chicory coffee. He handed her a cup and sat down on the wooden steps beside her, close enough that the heat radiating from his massive frame chased away the mountain chill. Sheriff Bowman resigned today, Harrison said quietly, staring out at the darkening valley. Marshal Boone sent a rider up the trail to tell me. They're appointing a new man. Someone from out of state, cleaning house. Good, Josie replied, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. The valley deserves clean air. Silence stretched between them, But it wasn't the suffocating, heavy silence of the winter. It was pregnant, thick with unspoken words and rising tension. Harrison slowly set his tin cup on the porch floor. He turned his head, his stormy eyes locking onto hers in the moonlight. "I never properly thanked you," Josie frowned slightly. "For riding to Virginia City?" "Harrison," we agreed. "Not for the ride," Harrison interrupted, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intimate register. He reached out, his large, rough fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his touch shockingly gentle for a man of his size. "For bringing this place back to life. For not letting me drown in my own guilt. You walked into a graveyard, Josie, and you planted a garden." Josie's breath hitched. She leaned into his touch, her heart hammering against her ribs just as it had the day they kissed in the cabin. "I didn't do it alone. You kept the wolves away. You gave me a home when the world threw me away." "I gave you a prison," Harrison corrected fiercely, his thumb brushing over her lower lip. "A contract bound in blood and ice. You deserved a courtship. You deserved a man in a fine suit who could take you to the theater in Street. Louis, not a brute who smells of pine sap and gun oil." Josie smiled, a wicked, beautiful spark in her eyes. "I find I have a distinct preference for pine sap." She didn't wait for him to close the distance. Josie dropped her quilt, leaning forward and pressing her lips to his. Harrison groaned, a deep, primal sound that vibrated in his chest. His massive hands swept around her waist, pulling her effortlessly onto his lap. The hesitation shattered. He kissed her with a desperate, starving intensity. His mouth hot and demanding, Josie tangled her fingers in his thick, dark hair, returning the kiss with all the pent-up fire she had been harboring for months. He broke the kiss only to drag his lips down the sensitive column of her neck, his beard rough against her skin, making her gasp his name. "Josie," he murmured against her collarbone, his breathing ragged. "Are you sure? I am not a gentleman." Josie looked down at the mountain man who had fought an army for her, who had carved a life out of the unforgiving rock, and who looked at her as if she were the only light left in the universe. "I have survived blizzards, bullets, and Hiram Lockwood," Josie whispered fiercely, her hands framing his rugged face. "I do not want a gentleman, Harrison Blake. I want my husband." Harrison didn't ask again. He stood up, carrying her in his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. He kicked the screen door open and carried her inside, past the dying embers of the hearth, past the heavy oak table where their contract had been forged, and walked into the bedroom he had avoided for a year. That night, the final remnants of the winter were burned away. In the absolute dark of the mountain cabin, they discovered a love that was as wild, uncompromising, and beautiful as the Montana high country itself. According to the archived diaries in the Montana Historical Society, Hiram Lockwood hanged in the autumn of 1887. Harrison and Josephine Blake never left their mountain claim. They built a sprawling cattle and timber operation that defied the harsh frontier. Sadie grew up to become one of the first female physicians in the territory, while May took over the family ranch, riding with the same fierce spirit as her father. Josephine Carter came to the Gallatin Valley as a broken, penniless girl seeking shelter from a lethal storm. She found a brutal world that demanded her absolute strength, and in return, it gave her a kingdom. The mountain man who bought her from a stagecoach wreck to raise his feral daughters ended up giving her his soul. Their story remains a testament to the fact that the wildest hearts are often the only ones worth taming.